So welcome everyone to today's Retrofit Talks. I'm Laura Broderick, the Commercial Partnerships Manager at the Building Centre, and I'll be introducing today's session, Retrofitting a Mid-Century Listed House. And this will be delivered by Katy Marks, founder of Citizens Design Bureau. Just before we get started on today's presentation, a little bit of the context of this online talk series, which is part of Retrofit 23, designed to connect professionals and discuss residential retrofit at the Building Centre. We're here to showcase the latest research and projects from architectural practice, offering valuable case studies and solutions for retrofitting homes. Our guest speakers for these online retrofit talks will present their projects, followed by a Q&A session with you, our webinar audience. So thank you very much for joining us today. Today is our 7th Retrofit Talks event, and if you missed the past sessions, please catch up with the recordings via our website or our YouTube channel. But for today, we have Katy Marks. She will share the practice's South Hill Park Terrace project in Hampstead, Camden. The project is a study in how being in a sensitive heritage environment impacts how we approach environmental and energy efficiency improvements. Katy will discuss the approaches to retrofit for this mid-century listed house, built 1956, constructed on the site of World War II bomb damage in a conservation area. She will talk about the history and ethos of the terrace too. A little bit about Katy. Katy is an architect with a master's in environmental design. She has extensive experience working with complex listed buildings and on projects with diverse creative communities at their core. For example, Jackson's Lane Theatre and the Jewish Museum in Manchester, which was a RIBA National Award winner this year. Katy sits on various London Design Review panels and is a design advocate for the Mayor of London. So we're very delighted that Katy could speak with us today. So without further ado, over to Katy. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, hopefully you can all hear me. Nice to be here today, and I'm glad that you have all made it. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see. Okay, so this is South Hill Park. As Laura said, it was built in 1956, designed by Bill and Jill Howell, and it was designed and built for a community in Hampstead. It's overlooking Hampstead Heath. It's sort of the best site in London, really, but it was at a time when Hampstead was not the sort of wealthy enclave that it is now. These were modest houses built on very modest budgets for a group of 6 families. And in fact, they still have a communal garden that overlooks the ponds in Hampstead Heath. So it's really, really getting across the sense that even though this is in leafy Hampstead, these were very, very simple houses at their core, built on a site of bomb damage with Victorian terraces either side of them. But you can see, with the vintage cars, the style of the house. And these are some of the original interiors. So what's really interesting is that our client actually grew up in the house. They were the first inhabitants, so they were there when it was being designed and built. And their elderly mother lived there until very recently, and then they inherited the house. So it's been a really lovely experience working with them, because the house is pretty much untouched. I mean, it's been very much touched by them, by the accretion of time and additions, but no sort of makeover in that kind of sense. So it's a really exciting project to work on. But it was very tired. So when we've taken it over, there's lots of damp problems. There's been changes in terms of the layout. They've added bathrooms and sort of roof extensions and various things in a slightly odd and higgledy-piggledy way. So just to take you through the kind of timeline of the building. So you can see on the top left-hand side, it was built in 1956. And as you can see, the really key thing to notice is that on the left-hand corner, there is a garage. And this house that's the end of the terrace is the house of our clients. And then you can see that in the 60s that, you know, it was pretty much the same. But what happened in the 80s, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that a first floor extension was built, and then again in the 19s, a second story extension was built. And those extensions, the ground and the first floor extension were actually designed by Jill Howell, so they were very much sort of in keeping with the style of the building. But the extension on the roof was something just added by the mother of our clients. And then in 2010, you can see what is there today. And what's important to notice, obviously you can't see from the black and white photo, you can't see it in color from the 1950s. But what's happened is that there've been a sort of accumulation of concrete repairs needed, so that the concrete beams across have been, the horizontal concrete beams have been painted, repaired and painted. And the windows have been replaced with dark aluminium framed windows rather than with the original hardwood timber, which you can see. So on the top left, you can see that the frames were much lighter and the horizontal horizontal concrete banding was much more prominent. So even from the 1956 to the 1960s, where it's been painted out, the appearance of the building has changed quite substantially. So we're at the stage where we're really having to think about which point in time do we want to take it back to in terms of the facade, and also what do we need to do to upgrade it for environmental reasons, for thermal efficiency reasons, as well as all the aesthetic changes inside it. But today, I just want to focus on the more sort of technical aspects of how we're renovating the envelope, and really also to put out there that this is very much a work in progress. Normally, I know that when architects give talks, it's sort of, here's one we did earlier with lots of pretty pictures. We're going to lay it all bare here, and you're just going to get lots of drawings and thoughts about where we are in the process, because we're very much mid-process and talking about some of the challenges that we're facing in addressing this project. So this is what it looks like right now. As I said, this basically the horizontal banding of the concrete floor slabs has been painted out. We've got these dark aluminium windows and this slightly odd rooftop level extension on the second floor that was above the garage that is sort of not quite resolved and a little bit higgledy-piggledy. And this is a slide that we wanted to show. This is something that's been done by our M&E engineers, Joel Gustafsson, which we've found really, really helpful. And it's been incredibly useful talking to the clients with this diagram. Because I think what happens and what we found, and probably some of you found doing residential extensions, is that everybody starts off saying, yes, we want to do it, you know, absolutely eco to the max, passive house, everything. And then budget becomes an issue, and, you know, and time scale and various different other priorities coming to the mix, not least with this particular project, the conservation issues. And so what we found ourselves asking on many projects was, okay, if we can't do everything, what's the most effective thing to do, and how can we explain that to a client? So this diagram was very much about explaining the sort of the cumulative and the broken down value of various different types of thermal upgrade. So basically, what you can see in green, for example, is the impact of improving the glazing. Then, which I was quite surprised by, the impact, which is relatively small, of insulating the ground floor slab. And that's presumably because it's quite, well, narrow front, deep plan, and it's over many floors. So proportionately, the heat loss through the floor is fairly low. Nevertheless, still would be worth doing if we could, but relative to other things, it's not as significant. External insulation is a really big issue for our client's house because they're the end of terrace. So they've got a very large exposed flank wall, which is completely uninsulated at the moment. And then what you see next to it is what would happen if you put external and cavity insulation. So that would beef it up even more. Then we've got triple glazing as a consideration, which is a marginal improvement, but obviously moving to double glazing is the most effective. And then we've got the inclusion of an MVHR whole house ventilation system, which is significant. But I think what we've been able to do through this diagram is to really show the client where they should spend their money, what's the most important thing to do. And I think from this, really clearly, we've seen that upgrading the glazing and that flank wall insulation are the most significant things to do. And in a listed building, things like introducing the sort of whole house ventilation system, MVHR unit, which would need dropped ceilings, felt like a step too far because of the impact that it would have internally. So what we've actually looked to do is to have individual standalone room-based MVHR units that are just set into the wall and don't require any ductwork. So that's a sort of halfway house that we've alighted on with that particular one. But this diagram has been incredibly useful. So this is sort of a quick diagram of what we felt the original might have looked like. And then this is effectively one of the options that we're looking at for renovating the facade. So what we're thinking of doing on that top floor of the extension is essentially just bringing the brickwork up and continuing a concrete ring beam all the way around the top. So this is a very simple approach to bringing that extension into line with the rest of the terrace, albeit still slightly set back as per Jill Howell's original drawings for the extension. But basically proposing to reinstate the original timber glazing. You'll notice that along the roof, we have introduced a lateral horizontal enclosure for air source heat pumps, which will be very much set back. And I will show you a roof plan to demonstrate that. This is a second option. As I say, this is totally up for grabs. And this is a precedent from other studio architects with this sort of chunky timber framing, where we've looked at potentially expressing the extension on the top floor as a sort of separate standalone element, expressing the fact that it is an extension and it came later in the process of in the life cycle of this building. And just to whip you through the plans that we're proposing so that you can see the context. So this is the lower ground floor. And the site is stepped, so at street level, it's a ground floor and there's a lower ground floor that opens onto the garden to the rear. So the rear is on the left-hand side, where we're proposing to put a kitchen and dining room, pantry, bike and utility, and a downstairs WC. On the ground floor, which is at street level with balconies, we've got a living room, piano space, and reopening a double height void and a study area. On the first floor, we've got bedrooms and bathrooms. And on the second floor, there is a completely separate standalone flat. where we are basically completely rebuilding this section that was what was the extension, and that had a greenhouse and other kind of things on the roof. So this is a completely new space that's been totally reconfigured in our proposals. And then what we're looking at really, this is an axonometric view of the front facade. And this is an option whereby we have externally insulated this flank wall. And this is an option where we've retained the brickwork as it is now, and we've added some sedum on the roof. And this is something that we're really grappling with at the moment. We're having discussions with the client, and now actually with the rest of the terrace as well, who now also want to come on board with looking at this process to thermally upgrade all of their houses in one go. So we're actually looking at upgrading the whole terrace, all of the facades, all of the roof, and then obviously the internal and the flank wall of our original client's house as well. And this is from the rear, again, with the external insulation and leaving the brick as it is. And then this is the second option, whereby we've taken this timber framing all the way around at the front and the rear. And then on the roof, what we wanted to do was look at an enclosure for air source heat pumps. And at the moment, we're discussing with the client to take this across the whole roof, and then looking at where you can see circled in red, there are potential clashes with existing roof lights. So this is a very current conversation at the moment. But at the moment, the roof needs to be upgraded anyway. It's not insulated. It was designed actually as a pooling roof or a blue roof, but it's got very minimal insulation, and so it's just wood wool underneath the felt. So this is something that is very, very important for us to upgrade as a priority. So what we're looking at doing is basically really keeping the concrete ring beam as slim as possible, and setting back the upstand so that you can see it in a minimal way, or you can't see it rather from the street, so that we can increase the insulation. And then on the extension side, setting that in, because we're rebuilding that roof completely, we can make that profile even lower. And then looking at the flank wall insulation has been a real priority for us. We've had lots of discussions and sketching lots of details about how if we did want to put something timber on that extension at the top floor, how would we detail that? But actually the principal issue that we need to address is how we insulate that flank wall. And really, sorry, these are quite crude, just going through this process of discussing it right now. But on the left-hand side, you can see this is what we have in the existing. So we've got an enormous coal bridge where the concrete slab goes right out to the exterior. And you've got a double skin brick wall with an air gap in between. So the first and sort of the easiest option to insulate it is to add cavity wall insulation. And that has a number of benefits that you can't see it from the outside, but there's a potential that the cavity is bridged by damp. We don't know what's in the cavity. We've looked in it, there's in various different places, but there's sort of detritus of various types, and so there's a sort of doubt about how effective that would be if we can't sort of physically fill it in a way that we can visibly see how sort of thorough that filling of the cavity can be. and to prevent damp tracking across the cavity. So there's worries about doing that and about how effective it can be. Also, even if it was as effective as it could be, it wouldn't meet Part L building regulation requirements. So the U value, so the insulation value that we would achieve would be 0.28, and really we need to be achieving 0.18 to be in line with Part L. So moving on to the sort of next option is internally insulating, which again would preserve the external appearance of the brickwork flank. And to be honest, we're still sort of in a toss-up between some of these options. And that, of course, preserves the external appearance of the building, but you still get quite a significant cold bridge where the concrete slab goes all the way from the interior to the exterior wall. And it also affects the way the wall meets the windows at each end of the building. So the last detail we've looked at is the potential to insulate externally. And what we've got here is an insulation bat, and then a wood fiber board, just 25 mil, and then lime render. And I think the really important thing to say about all these options is that we've learned the hard way with doing previous domestic extensions, the pitfalls of using non-breathable insulation in renovation projects, or indeed at all, but actually in renovation projects with existing buildings and historic buildings particularly, that, you know, old buildings sweat, and ventilation can be slightly difficult to achieve in a really consistent way without a whole house ventilation system. And so we've worked really hard in previous projects to develop details like this using breathable materials on the inside, on the internal face, and that includes breathable paints and breathable renders, breathable insulation, everything. And sorry, again, these are very crude drawings, but on the top left, you can see this is the existing plan detail of how we then meet the walls meet the windows. And then the second one down is showing cavity wall insulation, where we've basically chopped a little bit out of the brickwork so that there isn't a cold bridge where the windows meet the walls. So that's a marginal improvement. And then the third one down is where we're insulating internally. And what that means is that we then have to add in an extra frame in the window. So the window frames get more chunky to account for the fact that we are insulating internally, or we insulate externally. And that's what the two diagrams on the left are showing. And one of them, we've taken the insulation all the way around the front of the building, which has the disadvantage that it covers the brick wall, the end of the brick wall. And the one below is a sort of hybrid, which we're just in discussions about now. So where we stop the external insulation just short of the front facade so that we can retain that sense of the slim brick piers up the front, but we just insulate the cavity for about 600 mil back from that, so that we can sort of have the best of both worlds, have that flank wall external insulation, which is the most effective, and also retain these brick piers and the appearance of the brick piers at the front. And really that's sort of a summary of the kind of technical considerations that we've been looking at for this project. I could go into loads of detail about the internal spaces, but really wanted to just share a sort of process thinking and the sort of challenges that we've been facing, and allow time for discussion and questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Really fascinating to see behind the scenes thinking. I know we've got 1 or 2 questions starting to come in, so just giving people a few more minutes to think about what they want to ask of you. I personally just wondered, you mentioned you've, as a practice, been learning by past examples of where maybe you didn't always get it right and you've learned the hard way, I think is the phrase you used. So where are you looking for advice now? Obviously you're collaborating in-house, but where do you go to share learnings and ideas on what you should do?
So where we get advice from is we've been speaking particularly to a company called Timor in Wales, who've really advised us on the sort of use of natural products. And I guess, and it's maybe potentially a kind of controversial thing to say, since everybody's talking about passive house approaches to building, but I've actually become a little bit more skeptical about it, just in terms of effectively and this is not necessarily a criticism of passive house, but the way it's been enacted at the moment, and not using breathable products, because and the sort of reliance on effectively kind of wrapping everything in a sealed box and just sucking out the air with a straw, which is sort of effectively mixing the air in that way. And whilst that is very effective in some ways, it feels like it doesn't respond to the way that, especially historic buildings, the way they work. And so we've seen quite a lot of examples ourselves, as I said, learnt the hard way, where we've literally done everything by the book, in terms of externally insulating the reveals of windows, putting in the correct amount of ventilation capacity, all of that, and we've still got damp around the walls and really, real struggles. Had loads of people in to give us advice on it, and everyone's sort of scratching their heads. And since we've started using a more sort of breathable natural product approach, those issues don't appear, and it's quite clear. So yeah, that's been a really interesting learning for us.
Okay. Thank you, Katie. Now we do have lots of questions in now, so I will just start giving those to you, Katie, to respond to. So the first question came in from Brid. As there's so much glazed area on the front elevation, are you only considering insulating the end of terrace wall and rear walls?
Yeah, so basically, I should have spent more time perhaps looking at the rear elevation, but it's very similar to the front elevation. Basically, it's completely glazed wall to wall on the front and the rear. There are some solid panels on the front elevation, which we will be insulating as well, like a sort of low level up to kind of balustrade level. But no, that's why upgrading the glazing is so important, because the glazing forms the lion's share of the facade at the front and the back. Well, it's almost the total facade at the front and the back.
Great, thank you. And then from Chris, it seems like external insulation is the simplest option. Do you have any thoughts about the changing sense of place if all our terraces become rendered rather than brick?
Absolutely. I think it's a really big issue, and one that as I said, we're kind of struggling with, which is why we've started to look at this sort of slightly hybrid option, where we are looking at externally insulating just before the facade, but leaving that vertical strip so that you can see the sort of slim brick piers at the facade, and insulating in the cavity for that first 600 mil, so that you still get that sense of brick. I think the character of our buildings will change enormously with external insulation, and that it's not necessarily the right approach for all buildings, that we may simply need to accept that some, for some buildings, we are internally insulating and accepting that, they're not like completely optimum in that sense. But it's, I think, especially with sort of Victorian housing stock, where you've got materials, as I said, that are used to sort of breathing in a different way, it's quite problematic.
That's really interesting. Even just all the retrofit talks that we've had today, everybody's different bits of projects and research is coming together. I think at the end of the whole season in September, everyone needs to watch back every episode back to back and just see what the body of work is sort of saying. Anyhow, back to the questions, Katie. From Steve, is there any more that can be said about the individual room MVHR units?
Yeah, and this is really interesting actually, because we went back to our M&E engineer and said, look, we really want to make sure the ventilation is as good as it can be with heat recovery, but having a whole house ventilation system is so intrusive. We've, particularly with this sort of mid-century style where you've got exposed brick on the inside as well as on the outside, we've got sort of exposed slabs. There is nowhere to hide, everything is exposed. So the idea of dropping ceilings and that then sort of impacting on how it meets windows and everything, so many internal original features would be lost or compromised. And actually the same goes for even just sort of like new housing that we're doing now, when you have to give over sort of that much space in the ceiling for all this ductwork. It's quite a big thing. It's also very difficult to maintain and very disruptive to maintain. If something goes wrong with the ductwork or gets blocked or whatever, which we've had personally in our own house, it's a real old pain in the whatever. So we went back to our M&E engineer and said, what can you do? And he came back and said, well, you can use these standalone units. So they're not quite as efficient as the whole house system. So that's a trade-off. But they literally just slot into the wall and are dealing with particularly the most sort of heavy rooms in terms of like kitchen, bathroom, that sort of thing. And are quite unobtrusive and quite modestly sized. I mean, there's lots of different companies. I can recommend one, but that for us was a bit of a light bulb that's an option to consider. And I think it's a fairly new emerging technology, so it's definitely worth asking those questions, because I hadn't been aware of it until we've done this project. So which doesn't mean anything, but I think it is quite a new thing, and certainly something that our M&E engineer was quite excited about as well.
Great, thanks, Katie. And then Tom from Purcell asked, well, compliments on the talk firstly, but he asked, could you say more about how you were addressing air tightness other than the straw?
Yeah, so other than the straw. So basically what we are doing internally, obviously generally on the warm side of the insulation, is putting a breathable membrane inside. Sorry, what we've got is a sort of breathable paint that is going onto the facade. So we didn't want a membrane in a board. But we've got like a breathable paint that is doing that job on the brickwork facade. But any residual moisture, because we've got a breathable build-up, will be dealt with. But that is, that's a kind of toss-up question that we're struggling with sometimes, but it's actually quite a simple building in that sense, because we've just got one wall and then it's all windows. So it's just about that one wall, that flank wall. And then the roof, again, that's just a membrane going into the roof that's tucked into the joints. So it's, in a way, it's fairly simple as long as it can breathe.
Right. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, and we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to say no more questions in the chat, please, if that's all right. So just if we could try and rattle through, Katie, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
So Bob is
Sorry.
asking if you could say a little bit why you didn't show the cavity wall insulation as well as external wall insulation as an option.
So we actually did show the cavity wall insulation as an option, but in one of our slides, we don't think it's as effective. It doesn't get as high U value, it doesn't meet Part L, and there is a potential risk around bridging the cavity for damp, which we can see at the moment in the building.
Yeah. And someone else is asking about a focus on PVs. Did you look at those, and renewable energy heating? Did you look into those options?
Yes. In fact, the whole terrace have looked at that previously. And in terms of sort of payback time and the amount of area that would be needed to get something effective, again, we were advised by our service engineer that at the moment anyway, air source heat pumps were the most effective. What we also wanted to avoid was the fact that if we used solar PVs, we'd have to cover that entire roof, which would then mean we would need safe access to the whole roof, which would either mean a balustrade around the roof, which we wanted to avoid, or a sort of man-safe system which needs to be maintained, So actually having air source heat pumps where there is a smaller enclosure along this middle of the roof that can't be seen from the street, or only, you know, in the sort of long distance, felt like a good compromise.
Great. And then from Douglas, being a listed building, have you or do you expect to have challenges from planning and building control?
So we've actually had some pre-application meetings. The planners are, so far, the conservation officer, really supportive of the concept of upgrading the facade and returning it to the original materials, particularly the hardwood timber. I think we know that the challenge we're going to face is around putting air source heat pumps on the roof, which they've already raised, putting anything on the roof really. But also the use of external wall insulation on the flank wall. It's worth saying that most of that wall is not visible because there's a building right next to it. So there's just this sort of passageway of about 800 mil to a meter between our client's building and the next house. So it's only sort of at the ends that you glimpse this flank wall. So which is not to say that those little views, those snatched views of the flank wall aren't important. They are, and we're sort of agonizing over it a little bit. But I think that we can find a way to minimize the impact of it, and it's just so much more effective that external wall insulation, that it feels like the right thing to do in this context.
Great. There's a few questions coming in about which natural products. I know you're obviously not at the point of fully specifying everything because you're still kind of working through things. But when
I'm just scrabbling around trying to find it. I can tell you exactly what it is. I've got a piece of paper. Yeah. So it is 50 mil cozy wool between the studs at 600 mil centers. And so this is on the outside, and then 40 mil Schneider 180 wood fiberboard. There you go. And then 20 mil lime plaster.
Right, straight away.
That'll be £1,000, please.
I'll just find it in my back pocket. Question coming in again. You said well, sorry, this isn't the question. You mentioned the whole terrace had been looking at the PVs before. So your question from Julian is about that kind of neighborhood approach. So how did you get the whole terrace on board with the retrofit? Say a bit more on that, Katy.
Well, don't be too impressed. It's not happened yet. And it's a really interesting one, because it started with us obviously talking to our clients at number 80, which is the end of Terrace House, and then because the terrace has this communal garden which they keep at the end of their gardens, that they share, they have a kind of culture of talking to each other already and cooperating on at least their gardening. And have been talking about upgrading their facades for some time, because they're aware that because it's such a sort of unified terrace, they all know that it would kind of look ridiculous if only one of them decided to redo their facade and go back to being timber. There's a number of architects who live in the terrace, which makes lots of fun for us all having differing opinions about things, but actually in all the principal ways we're agreed that the way forward is for everyone to work together. And so what they're doing is forming a special purpose vehicle company, and nominating one person in the terrace to be the sort of spokesperson to deal with us, so that we can, because in a way architecturally it's not so complicated. There's one detail that gets replicated across the terrace, but you can see that in terms of our time, there's a lot of potential for disagreements, for individual people changing their minds and everything. So what we're trying to do is put in place a really kind of streamlined system for them agreeing amongst themselves and then telling us. But I'll let you know how that goes. I mean, we're in the middle of the process.
Right. Well, thank you, Katy. And I know there are some outstanding questions, but I'm conscious of time. So what I will do is I'll make sure all those questions are downloaded and shared with Katy, so at least she can see what people were interested in with the project. And assume, Katy, people can follow Citizens Design Bureau and keep in touch with the practice through your website and socials.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we're Citizens Design Bureau on Instagram. Don't really do much on Twitter. Got a website, but we're getting contacted if you want to talk to us.
Exactly. And I'm sure there'll be more to be revealed about the project as it progresses and things. So thank you, Katy, for sharing the thought processes and all the work that's been done to date. And thank you everyone for attending today. We have been recording it, so we will put it up online shortly, as I mentioned before, on our web pages at thebuildingcentre.co.uk and also on the Building Centre's YouTube channel. We do have a final Retrofit Talks event next week before the summer break, and that's with Sarah Wigglesworth Architects next Tuesday lunchtime. That's the 18th of July. So again, book via Eventbrite for that. If you can attend, that would be great. And if you are based in London and can do in-person events, we've got 2 this week. We've got one tomorrow evening, which is all about heritage and conservation. So probably some of the things, Katy, you've been sharing will be applicable there. And then on Thursday evening, we've got a session with Arabs around the topic of urban heat and overheating with our homes. So if you can come along, they're also free and being hosted here at the Building Centre in central London. Again, you can book via the website. So yeah, just lots happening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks again to Katy for talking. It's been great to learn about the project. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.